Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining for our webinar on anti-Semitism in the mainstream. This is a topic that's, I think, on a lot of people's mind. It's a lot of discussion is, I think, recently in the last couple of years, last maybe, I don't know, 36 months, 48 months, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism. The rise in anti-Semitism, look, the reality is throughout, Rabbi Dvidovitz, you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you remember, you told me how when you were a kid growing up, when you used to walk to shul, you told me that it was maybe every other week you used to get someone hollering at you.
Yes. In upstate New York, very suburban, I think Rochester, New York is like the friendliest city. I think it was at one point like the friendliest city to live in. But I don't think they asked, do you hate Jews, when they rated if it was the friendliest place to live in. So the answer, or maybe the people wouldn't have the guts to respond to that. But yeah, we did usually walking to shul with my dad, and usually a bunch of us walking together. It was pretty much, like Ramet said, probably every other week where someone would say Hail Hitler or something like that on the way. And we would laugh because we knew they didn't have the guts to get out of the car, and it was fine, but growing up with it, looking back, it was interesting.
A number of years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, I was walking to the Kollel on Shabbos with my two oldest boys, and my father-in-law was also there with me, right here in Las Vegas, in Summerlin, nice neighborhood, and we had someone drive by shouting at me and my kids something about Hitler this, Hitler that, and I think things like that, especially, I wear my yarmulke very proudly on my head, as do you, and very noticeably Jewish. The fact that, you've been hollered at and I've been hollered at, I don't think is a surprise. I think what is the concern is how in the last 36 months, ballpark, I think we've seen not just a rise in anti-Semitism kind of on a very low level, but in the mainstream as well. We just Googling, before the class tonight, some statistics. And I found this on standwithus.org. They point out that though Jews make up just 2% of all Americans, the FBI reported that in 2017, they were subject to 58% of all religiously motivated hate crimes.
That's an amazing statistic.
That's an amazingly shocking statistic. In France and Germany, there has been a surge in anti-Semitic incidents, 74% in the former, 60% in the latter. In the state of Nevada, it's not just individualized anti-Semitism, but it's slowly creeping into an institutionalized, although it's not in the government, that kind of institution, but the head of the chairwoman of the Democratic Party of the state of Nevada, and this is not a political statement at all, she is she's aligned herself with openly anti-Semitic groups. That's a shocking thing, and she had to pay for it, but how that could even happen is really, really scary.
And I would throw out, without getting into too much detail, so Meth and I are privy to some of the interior politics of the Republican Party in Nevada, where it was last year, 2 years ago, the Republican Party was almost hijacked by some incredibly interesting alt-right, folks who not known for their love of Jewish people.
So this is an issue on the extreme on the right, extreme on the left. It's not a political issue, and I really think it's, for the sake of honesty, I think if everyone turns it into a political conversation, we're doing ourselves as Jews a very, very big disservice. I think we have to stay out of blaming this party or that party. It's a certain reality that it's everywhere in the mainstream.
Right. And I just want to interrupt just real quick. I feel like anti-Semitism in Europe, the way I see it, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's really old news. I mean, old news in the sense that, 70 years ago, we were going to gas chambers. And even over the last, I remember speaking to a rabbi who had moved to America about 12, 13 years ago. And he said he moved to America because, this is Rabbi Y.Y. Rubinstein. He moved to America, he said, because he was doing college outreach in England, and he said Europe is, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and there's just no more room for Jews there. So he came to America, and what he said then is, interestingly, he said America is 10 years behind. I still hope he's wrong, but he's more right than I thought he was then. Like, we really have seen, like in our backyard, a real uptick in anti-Semitism, and this is in the news we're talking about specifically, without getting into, I don't want to validate the different stars in sometimes the political world or in the entertainment world that are being openly anti-Semitic.
West. Sorry.
Right. So I don't want to validate anyone like that. But again, it's becoming more normal to do things like this.
And yes, to your point, like we have, people in pop culture, the Kanye Wests, the Kyrie Irvings of the world, who are mainstream figures, who not only are they mainstream figures, they have humongous followings in social media. Kyrie Irving has tens of millions. Kanye has tens of millions of followers. He posts something, anti-Semitic DEFCON 3 on the Jews. I think they said is like there are twice the amount of Jews there are in the world. He has twice that amount of Instagram followers, which is it's scary and shocking. The reality is anti-Semitism goes back a long time. I'll tell you a story, Rabbi. Is when I was growing up as a child, one of the most sacred, moments of the year, of course, naturally would be the Passover Seder. And you'd be sitting down for the Pesach Seder. It would be, usually I was at home, and my parents, and usually my dad's parents would join us for the Passover Seder. And when we got up to the passage in the Haggadah, if you recall, we recite V'hisha amda lavosenu v'lanu shelo echad bilvad amad lechalosenu ella shebachol dar v'dar omdim aleinu lechalosenu. We recite in the Passover Haggadah the translation that every generation our enemies rise up to try to destroy us. And it would be at that point when we talk about the story of the Exodus and really the slavery in Egypt and the persecution of the Jews in Egypt. We talk about that it wasn't just Egypt that had to deal with anti-Semitism, but rather b'chol dar v'dar, in every generation, omdim aleinu lechalosenu, they rise up against us, to try to destroy us. And my grandparents, who were both my father's parents, who were both Holocaust survivors, they knew what that meant. They lost everything. My grandmother, bless her memory, not only did her parents, her siblings all get murdered by the Nazis, she was virtually the only survivor of her town, virtually the only survivor of her entire city. And my grandfather, a very similar story. And they would share their the woes of their background. And I always remember as a child, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, a time of stability, relatively speaking, and peace, and always thinking that that's so disconnected from my reality. And as I would hear their stories and see their tears, and always think that that's not my reality. But as I get a little older and a little wiser, we realize, please God, I don't think we're headed quite to that direction. But the reality of anti-Semitism, my grandparents' experience being the extreme, it's b'chol dar v'dar. It's every generation. And just to conclude that thought is we in the Passover Haggadah, after we recite that, we then talk about Bikesh Lavan Lakar Es Hakol. We describe a historical accounting of how even before the Jewish people were the Jewish people, it was literally just Jacob and his small family. Bikesh Lavan Lakar Es Hakol. Lavan, the evil Lavan, was Jacob's own father-in-law. Lakar Es Hakol. He wanted to destroy the Jewish people. Literally from our inception as a nation, we've had to deal with anti-Semitism, whether it's been Lavan, whether it's been the Egyptians, whether it's been the Babylonians, whether it's been the Assyrians, whether it's been the Greeks, the Romans, we've had, and the Nazis, just going on and on. We have an unending history of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly. So there's actually, we didn't discuss this before, but there's a famous question that Vilna Gaon asks on that passage in the Haggadah. He says, I know that, well, he obviously didn't know about the Holocaust, but he knew about the Inquisition and the Crusades and other times in history that, we had such, obvious persecution. He says, but can it be said that in every generation they're there? Right. And his answer is yes, they're there. They're just not always successful. And I think that really speaks to what we're discussing now, anti-Semitism in the mainstream, which was the title of tonight's webinar, is that we're not discussing anti-Semitism as a new thing.
Right.
And it's always there and it's always going to be there. But what we've seen differently is, while we know maybe it's in people's hearts, it's coming out. And I have just like a lesson. that I learned, and it's interesting how little things shape you from a young age. I remember shopping with my dad. It actually wasn't quite shopping, but my parents had ordered some custom rugs for our home when I was a little kid. And I went with my dad to go pick it up. Not that he needed my help, but probably my mother needed me not to be in the house. That's what I'm guessing as I was thinking through the story on the way over tonight. And we get there, and my father looks at these rugs. I remember the rugs, we had them for a long time. And there was a real imperfection the way they were made. There was something really, it was just not done right. And now he started arguing with the guy, say, hey, this is not what we ordered. We wanted this is this, right? So the guy says, let me call my wife, my dad says, let me call my wife and tell her what's going on because she doesn't want me to bring it home. I'm not going to bring it home. So she calls up. And then the guy, I remember this clear as day. I don't think I was more than 8 or 9 years old. I remember this so clearly. The guy says, let me speak to your wife. So my dad gives him the phone. This was no cell phone. This is like a long cord. My dad gives him the phone. And he says, your husband is here. And because he's Jewish and he learns Talmud, he's trying to negotiate the price down.
Wow. And
I remember the look on my dad's face. And I remember the look of this guy on this guy. He was an older man with white hair. And I'm like, whoa, that's interesting. That was like the icing on the Hail Hitler that I heard. So in the sense that I don't think any of us, if you lived openly as a Jew, you're used to anti-Semitism. I'm just going to give you one more that is just one of my recent favorites, is I was in Albertsons, right here near the Kollel. It was about 2 years ago, no, 1.5 years ago. And I'm shopping pretty late at night. We're about to close. And I'm wearing my hat. Most of you guys have seen my hat before. I took it off for this. And I'm wearing a hat. And the guy says to me, the guy who's bagging my groceries, African-American gentleman, he says to me, are you Amish? So I said, no, I'm the other ish. And I was just teasing with him. He says, oh, you're the ones with all the money.
Wow.
I'm like, well, first of all, I used to have a lot of money until I started shopping at Albertsons. Quote me on that, right? But beyond that, right? I'm like, whoa, where'd that come from? I'm just teasing this guy. We're just having a good time. And again, that's this was normal for him. He wasn't mad at me.
Right.
Except for, yes, he was, because I have all the money.
Right. It was just like a casual anti-Semitic reference.
I
guess, one of the questions.
Oh,
I'm sorry if you just got unmuted there. The question, I think there's so much to talk about and there's so much conversation, on the topic of anti-Semitism, and we can, have, write a PhD thesis on this topic. So we'll try to see what we can cover, tonight. But I guess one of the questions that, when we were just, myself and Rabbi Vidowitz, when we were, putting our minds together, what we wanted to cover in tonight's webinar, one of the questions that we wanted to address from a Torah perspective, Torah sources, is why is there anti-Semitism? Fundamentally, why is it that, Rabbi Vidowitz walks into an Albertsons and a random person, out of the blue, just drops an anti-Semitic, comment like that? Why is it that going back literally to the inception of the Jewish people as a nation, Bikesh Lavan Lakar as Hakol, from the times of Lavan till today, why is it that there's always been so much anti-Semitism? And I think one of the things that we talked about is that obviously there isn't just one answer. I don't think that there's one reason that we can explain all of anti-Semitism. I think hate comes from a lot of different reasons, from a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of different origins. But that said, I think there are several broad ideas that are fairly universal, ubiquitous, or common reasons that I think the Torah tells us through different sources that I think are very informative and helpful.
Such as what, Rabbi?
So one of the things that when we were talking about this, there was a passage in the Talmud that we both immediately thought of. The Talmud says, let's see if I can get the quote of it, so we'll be accurate. Talmud Tractate Shabbos, Daf Peites Amid Aleph, that's 89a. It says, "My Har Sinai." We know that Judaism, God gives us the Torah at Mount Sinai. What the Talmud sees an allusion, as it does often when it comes to names and places. It finds allusions, hints, references in the meanings of names. So what does the word Sinai, which is how you say Sinai in Hebrew, what does the word Sinai, what does it allude to? The Talmud says, Sheyarda Sina la'akum alav. It brought down hatred. Sinai and the story of, when we became a nation, God giving us the Torah, it brought hatred to the world. Specifically enmity between the Jewish people and others. And the question is, why? What's the explanation for that? So I want to just, I was fortuitously, I was at a class this week where one of my rabbis was lecturing, and he quoted a passage from Rabbeinu Nissim Ran, writing in the, I'll make this up, I believe in the 14th century in Spain, northern Spain. He writes to explain this passage of the Talmud. I'll just read directly what he says, and I'll translate. He says, the reason why when we received the Torah, when we became a Jewish nation, particularly with the Torah, it created enmity between us and others people not liking us, is God, by giving the Jewish people the Torah, separated the Jewish people from all the other nations of the world. Specifically, Jewish people, one of the prohibitions, are prohibited from marrying a non-Jew unless they convert. We're not allowed to go ahead as Jews. The Torah prohibits eating non-kosher food.
No ham sandwiches.
No ham sandwiches. The BLTs are, prohibited. And he says brilliantly, the Ran teaches, distance and separation, maybe al kapanim lidei zeh. Richuk and hevdel. Distance, separation. The reality is, being Jewish, being a practicing Jew, certainly, you are different in terms of who you can marry, what you can eat, how you socialize. There are differences. And the way my rabbi explained what Rabbeinu Nissim is teaching us is it's a very practical, almost sociological phenomenon that's really not limited to Judaism, but it's what we would call in-group, out-group bias. It's a human cognitive bias, whereby when there's difference between you and another group, you naturally have a bias not to like that other group. That's a natural phenomenon. And the Torah, with its many regulations, many requirements, and many values and beliefs, we're different. I don't eat non-kosher. Who I marry, what a lot of the behaviors that I do create differences. What I believe in. I don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Even something as simple as that, which is a major idea, that's going to create, a difference, just an in-group, out-group bias.
Completely. By the way, where I see, for the Bible buffs in the audience, where I see this really beautifully is one of the greatest arguments for anti-Semitism in the Torah is made by Haman or Haman to Achashverosh, the king of Persia. Yep. What does he say? He doesn't say that the Jewish people, they're blood libels or they're bad. He just says they're just different. Yeah. And he just emphasized they're different. That's all he says. And that's enough of an argument. Okay, if you're sure they're different, then let's get rid of them. Right? That's what seems to be the argument, so to speak, of anti-Semitism in the Torah.
And just as an example of this idea, it's obvious, but it's worth thinking about for a minute. Is I don't know about many of you, but on Monday night, what did I do late at night? I watched a recording of the college football championship, game. Now, if you know me, I love football. My family, we love football. I see Mark smiling, right? And I remember I sat down, to watch the game. We're watching as a family. We're watching a thing. Now, as friends, I don't care much for college football. I don't watch much college football, but it's a national championship. We're going to watch it. And I sit down, we're watching the game. And I immediately, I asked my family, I asked my kids, who are you rooting for? And stop and think about it. Who am I rooting for? TCU or Georgia? I've got nothing to do with either of those colleges. literally thousands of miles away, literally, not figured, I have nothing to do. Why would I root for either one of those teams? Number one. Number two, how would I even bother answering that question? Like, what does it mean based on like, I like the blue color of TCU's jersey? Do I like the red of Georgia? What? And the answer is yes. Yes, because let's say you like their jersey a little bit more. You identify with that jersey. So they're my group. And now I'm rooting for one team and not for another. Like, where does that even come from psychologically? And it's an illustration. We root for teams. Why do we root for teams? I get it. You root for the Raiders. They're your local team. But even that, like, they don't care about you. You don't care about them. It's such an arbitrary thing. We form allegiances. And I hate the Dallas Cowboys. Why do I hate the Dallas Cowboys? Well, aside from the fact that God hates the Dallas Cowboys, putting that aside, why do I hate the Dallas? I don't know why I hate the Dallas Cowboys, because that's how I hate the Dallas Cowboys. If we really stop and think about it, okay, it's just sports. Hopefully it's not a big deal, but it highlights a certain human bias and tendency.
I don't know. I think if you would have said you hate the Dolphins, I would have understood that. I'm a Buffalo fan growing up,
there you go.
But no, 100%. It's so true. And it's so silly.
It's silly.
There's no reason for it, but it's such a part of how we relate to the world. And I think, again, getting to really the focus of what we're doing tonight is the next question. So we've given one of the explanations, and I think it's worth mentioning there are many sources in the Talmud and the Torah which point towards deeper spiritual, maybe even mystical reasons for anti-Semitism, and there's one that we want to kind of get to at the end. But I think that working with that Ron's approach of understanding the fact that we are different and we're supposed to be different, it's a good thing that we're different. That's going to be a natural outcome of being different, is we're going to inspire hate. And it's the way it is.
It's worth, I think one of the things we talked about, and it is worth pointing out, that doesn't mean that everyone is doomed and destined to hate us, or that if I see someone who's different than me, I am doomed to, I'm forced by my human nature, I must hate that person. Rather, what Ron is highlighting, and again, this has just been confirmed by social psychology, is it's a tendency, it's a bias, it's a natural thing. It's how God hardwired us, it's just how we're created, is that people or groups that are different than us, we have a natural bias to not like them quite as much.
Right. And I want to jump on that for a second. Rabbi Matthew and I were discussing this the other day. We thought of an amazing antidote to anti-Semitism. Is if we just all stop being different, then we'll have no more anti-Semitism, because we'll eat ham sandwiches on Yom Kippur and etc. We'll just leave all of the things that the Torah teaches us to do. We'll start being like the rest of the world. Now, the truth of the matter is, history has shown, like in recent history in the Holocaust, that it might take a few generations for us to be assimilated enough. We've all heard, I was Jewish enough for Hitler, I'm Jewish enough, for this. But it is true that probably in, 100 years or so, if we all just make a solemn pact, to abandon the Torah completely, we will solve anti-Semitism. We also will commit the actual final solution.
Yeah,
it's like Jewish evil. And I remember reading an article a couple of years back by a scholar who was pretty much arguing that. He was saying the Jewish people have contributed a lot to the world. And all right, it's time to move on. Let's kind of fade off into assimilate into oblivion. And it was interesting because from his perspective of not valuing the spiritual lessons of the Torah, I agree with him. That actually makes a lot of sense. Why do you keep being different? Just assimilate into the rest of the nations and everything's going to be great. You've contributed. We did important things, like we made scientists who made like atom bombs and things like that. So we've done great things. So now we can move on. But if we value the Torah, we value the lessons of the Torah, well, we must remain different. And there's a value in being different. And we'll get to some of what that value is. But therefore, just to kind of just bring it back to what Matt was saying again, right? We're not saying that it's predetermined that everyone will always hate us, but it is baked into the reality. This will always be a problem that we need to be cognizant of and address and be in tiptoe around.
And it really, and to build on Rabbi what you're arguing, it's a very insightful observation, which is it's almost by definition it creates a tension. To whatever degree we want to be proud of our Judaism, which as a rabbi, that's something that I'm pushing, and I know you are, Rabbi. It's our job, it's our mission to teach the beauty of Judaism.
They are too.
as everyone, hopefully everyone who's listening to my voice within my earshot, right? We're trying to promote the value and beauty of Judaism and why, the messages of the Torah and why these values and these ideals are so important. To whatever degree we try to do that, it's a double-edged sword. It's going to create a certain separation. And as Rabbeinu Nissim tells us, Hevdel v'harichuk, separation and distance, however defined we become, someone else has the potential to say, that guy's different than me, I don't like them. And it should be noted, it's not just limited to Jews and non-Jews. It's any in-group, out-group. This is the reason why the African-American community has been marginalized throughout the United States, history. They physically look different. So it's easier to go ahead and say, that guy is not part of my race. I'm going to discriminate. I'm going to hate. I'm going to, all of that. Racism in general and all types of xenophobia, it really just comes from in-group, out-group bias. You're different than me. I don't like you.
And I'm glad that you said marginalized, because one of the other ideas that we were kicking around is,
this is
why is it, what has changed in recent history or recent present that has made anti-Semitism come to the forefront?
We were struggling with this, which is and I think that's what is on everyone's mind, where it has been in the last 48 months, let's say, where we all have felt like an uptick in anti-Semitism. Where is that coming from? As Rabbi, you've been pointing out, the fact that people don't like us has been around for millennia. Why is it that in the United States today, in the immediate recent past, we tend to feel it more? And I think you said something very, very profound.
Yeah,
and I think there's a lot of wisdom to it.
And what we were discussing, the idea that it's interesting that a lot of times, and by the way, it's interesting that I think really it fits very well with Iran. I don't think anti-Semitism is unique. I think there's plenty of people who hate African Americans and hate, recently after COVID, Asians have become a huge target of racial discrimination. Sure. But I think that what's unique about the Jewish people is that, and I say this in a positive, thank God, we are not a marginalized group. We're the ones with all the money. Now, I don't actually believe that's true but we do have some. And I think that, as much of that maybe is blown out of proportion, but there is truth to it. And when there is a group in America, in the culture that we all appreciate today, that is not marginalized, that's not really considered
economically marginalized
or even socially we have our own, there's mega churches and there's mega temples and Jews are in great public office and great in entertainment, right? We have a lot of big names, not so many great athletes, but we're working on that. But they're Jews everywhere in very high, maybe even disproportionately, in high places. All the stuff about Wall Street being a Jewish, there is truth to that.
Jews have been very, very successful.
Very successful
in the United States, particularly, but around the globe.
Again, they're 2% of all Americans are Jews. What percentage of major sports owners are Jews?
It's significant. 11% of the United States Congress is Jewish.
Right. That's a crazy number. So because of that, we're an easy target, and no one's feeling bad for us, and it becomes okay to do things. And then I think what sometimes, which is the most dangerous thing, and I do want to make sure we get started focusing more on solutions.
Yeah.
But sometimes the most dangerous thing is you can have one guy, I never met Kanye West, nor do I plan to. He hasn't asked me for a meeting recently, and if he would, I would say no, thank you. But understand the chance of Kanye West ever buying an AK-47 and going shooting a lot of Jewish people is very, very low. Because ultimately, he's primarily focused on things that make him money. And it's hard to make money, when you're on the FBI most wanted list or you get shot by a security officer. However, there is someone out there who wears Kanye's shoes and worships at the Kanye altar who really has got nothing to lose. And he is going to buy AK-47 and he's going to do the best he can to mow down because that's what he hears. And that's sometimes why the anti-Semitism in the mainstream is a problem. We're going to talk about the New York Times a little bit. Is anyone on this chat, on this webinar, is anyone nervous here? The New York Times is about to buy some space and have a gas chamber in it? No, that's not what we're nervous about. But are we nervous that the New York Times doing what they're doing is going to inspire that crazy guy to do that? Or a guy who's not totally crazy, but a little crazy? The answer is yes. And that's really, history has been that way forever.
Yeah, and I think just to put a bow around that, the idea that we were talking about is particularly in the last 2-3 years, as there's been, and I think this is a good thing in our culture and society, there has been a push that other more marginalized groups in the United States have been a lot more vocal about how they've been marginalized. So that natural tendency of the masses to look for out groups to dislike, well, they haven't been able to pick on so many marginalized groups. It's not trendy anymore. So what is an easy target is let's pick on a successful group, a group that has achieved a lot of success and hate on them. And that's just a theory. I don't know how much truth there is to it, but I think it's very smart. One of the things that really prompted this discussion was, and it's on the flyer, was that issue of the New York Times. Maybe let's jump to that. Is over the last couple months, luckily, thank God, we haven't been getting a ton of this in Nevada, but in New York, particularly in the last, maybe 8 to 12 months, the New York Times has been publishing a series of exposés, of articles, really highlighting some of the flaws, scandals, as it were, particularly within the Orthodox Jewish community. I'm holding a list of someone, April 26th. The article is a book review about an orphan Jewish boy who gets molested. August 5th, an emotional account of an Orthodox Jewish girl and how she got, marginalized in her group. September 11th, in Hasidic enclaves, failing private schools flush with public money. September 11th again, there's an article, share your stories about Hasidic schools. And the list goes on and on and on, dozens of stories, maybe about well over a dozen stories just in the last few months, highlighting, some of the flaws and very one-sided accounts, within the Jewish community, being portrayed by the New York Times, and
that got us thinking. Really, a critical question to ask is, what is anti-Semitism? Sometimes, like it happened to me today, I take my kids to the doctor, and there was no parking spot available nearby, and I had 2 kids with me, and a stroller was very, very difficult. There might be anti-Semitism. People, park there. They weren't Jewish. I am Jewish, and they took all the good spots. Rabbi, is that anti-Semitism?
So I would say no, that's not anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Just because my Washington Redskins or whoever they are, just because they had an awful, season this year, again, that's not anti-Semitism. That's not because they hate me, right? So we have to know what
most people who cut you off and who do other not nice things to you between now and the day you pass 120 years and leave this world are not doing it because you're Jewish. They're just not necessarily so nice. Right.
And the reality is that, when we were, talking about this, we sent out some of the marketing material about, the New York Times and how they've been really been launching these one-sided portrayals and of the Jewish community and what's going on in the Jewish community. And, one of my friends, a good friend of my wife, she reached out and she said, you should know a lot of those articles are actually true. A lot of the things that they're bringing up are true. And I wrote back, I said, I have no doubt that many, if not most, although I don't think it's most, some or many of what they write about, is true. Some of the, problems, flaws, warts within the Jewish community. I said, I have no question about that. My question is why is the New York Times publishing 24 articles about the warts of the Jewish community? Every community is going to have flaws and warts. Why are you choosing you want to write a story every now and again, investigative journalism, I guess that's your job. But when there's this heavily disproportionate scrutiny, when any time that there is a flaw or something wrong in the Jewish community, it's literally on the front cover of the New York Times. Any community has problems. Every community has shortcomings. You can write an entire book.
I'm just imagining for a second. Imagine if we wrote an expose about the NBA being anti-Semitic because Kyrie Irving's in the NBA. And the answer is, well, it's true. There is a guy, his name is Kyrie Irving, who's an anti-Semite. Adding context, Ramesh pointed out he's also a flat earth guy, which makes you wonder just about his credentials to have a wise opinion about how the world works. but it's true, but you can't really, it's not honest. And it would be almost a lie and even slanderous to paint a picture of the NBA by having one person. All rappers are anti-Semitic. Look how anti-Semitic rappers are. Look at Kanye West. Right. No, that's not true. And the fact that the New York Times has been writing this and doing this and has been called out on it constantly and continues to do this. Right. That's really the question. I read the first 2 or 3. Afterwards, I wasn't really interested in being their clickbait. That's the proper way to say that. And I kind of stopped reading it. But we have been reading reviews of people who have read it, etc. And it gets back to a famous quote. What is anti-Semitism? You'll know it when you see it. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to be introspective. And I think also another area where this really comes in, and this is maybe a little more insidious, is anti-Zionism. Yeah, and it's you'll see people, offering very anti-Israel opinions, representatives in the United States House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And if you call them out and say you're being anti-Semitic, so you'll often hear the response, no, I love Jews and I love Jews everywhere. I'm just calling out problems that I see. And, I'm allowed to say that I disagree with the political policy, happening here in Israel. There's a flaw in the IDF. They were too aggressive, in a particular campaign or something like that. But Jews, I love them. You see that all the time, and people trying to drive a wedge between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel. And I think that it's exactly, Rabbi Davidow, it's your point, is really highlighted here, which is, yes, academically, theoretically, in a vacuum, that distinction is a good distinction. One can love Jews and criticize a political or even stand against
a political opinion or something that Israel does that we don't like. The problem is that when you have
you could stand against the whole Jewish state,
right?
There is an argument to be made that let's leave the Middle East for the Arabs, let the Jews go somewhere else. I don't buy into that argument, but there is an argument to be made.
The challenge is when you have a pattern, similar to like the New York Times. Is if you want to draw on one story, a flaw here, a flaw there, that's fine. But when there's a disproportionate pattern of attack, of highlighting every single flaw, every single time Israel does something wrong, there's a resolution in the UN against it. But
I would say forget the UN. Much more important. What's your favorite kind of ice cream?
Ben and Jerry's.
That used to be your favorite kind,
right?
That was that famous interview with Ben and Jerry, where they're completely unable to explain why the only genocide that they're against is in Israel, like Darfur, other places like that.
That we don't care about.
Why? We're not really sure. We just know Israel's like really bad.
And that's where like the context and having the broader idea, that's why it's so important, is where you see a pattern is, yes, you cannot like, a practice, happening within the Orthodox community in New York City and write an article about that. You can stand up against a perceived wrong happening in the state of Israel. But when that's all of you that you do, and to the exclusion of criticizing other groups, other countries, and other, so then you have to ask yourself, are you really anti-Israel, or is that just a code word for anti-Semitism? And the reality is 99 times out of 99 times when someone speaks negatively about Israel, it's just an excuse for being it's just anti-Semitism just coming out. Nowadays, it's not cool to get up and say, throw Jews into gas chambers. That's not accepted. But what is accepted? To hide behind a political opinion, to hide behind, I'm just writing an article about, about molestation. But if that's all you're writing about in the Jewish community, you have to wonder.
And then again, to point out that human history, and actually, if you're following the weekly Torah portion, this is the story of the slavery in Egypt. Is it always starts with something,
right?
So where is this going to end? Meth said he doesn't see us being in gas chambers in America in 20 or 50 years. I agree with you, but if that could happen, then it would be starting somewhere, right. And that really gets us to our next point. of, so what can we do?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that the simplest answer to that question, before that takes almost no work, is what we're doing right now, is making a statement, advertising the fact that we're going to be talking about this, calling out the people that are doing it, because the bottom line is, even though we're small in number, everything makes a difference. Again, sending out political emails to people who agree with you, no, that's not really going to help very much. But calling out in public, standing up in public and saying, I believe this is anti-Semitism, I believe this is wrong, that's a small thing that we can do.
And, to your point, Rabbi, is I do think political activism, within reason and to whatever degree, a person is influential, I think, there is value in that. And, for example, I do try to call our elected officials on a fairly regular basis, so that they recognize we exist, we're here, and we're not, okay with, with anti-Semitism.
Right. By the way, organizations like AIPAC, Agudas Israel of America, are constantly, if you're not on their email list, you should be.
Yeah, you should get on that.
And they're constantly saying, hey, send a letter to your representative. And all you have to do is a few clicks.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is these things are read, and they are, that your representative is not actually reading it. There's a staffer somewhere that is tallying these opinion emails that come in and letting people know, because ultimately everybody wants to get reelected.
Exactly. If you've, for folks who are watching, we're from Las Vegas, if you're driving on the 95 south, so you're driving, let's say, from Summerlin towards Henderson, right past the Spaghetti Bowl, right past the 15, the interchange with the 15. I don't know if there's anyone noticed, there's a billboard there. There's a big billboard by a group, I think they're Stand With Us, calling out anti-Semitism. Talking about how, the Holocaust isn't that far away, and we need to remind ourselves of that. It's right there, right by the World Market Center, right there, very prominently. And this group, Stand With Us, they've been taking out billboards and advertisements around the country in very, very prominent places. And I remember, just the other day, I asked you, Rabbi, I said, do you think that's effective? Do you think that's doing anything? And I was surprised with your answer.
I said 100%. There's no question.
I was surprised.
There's no question. It always works to yell at someone because however much they don't deserve being yelled at, they're going to think twice before they do it again.
Right.
So are you changing someone's opinion? Probably not. Are you putting people on notice? I remember, I was working on something for my blog. Some of you guys have read it, about anti-Semitism a long time ago. And right as I was writing this piece, so Ronald Lauder had, I hope he's still alive, he had donated $25 million to basically elect official and get rid of officials who are pro and against, Israel and specifically Jewish people, anti-Semitism. If you're willing to invest, you have the kind of pockets that can invest in mass media campaigns and political agendas, yeah, absolutely, you can move the needle. You can get people elected who are pro-Israel, there's no question about it, who are pro-Jewish, and that actually makes a difference. But for most of us, we're not really able to do that.
I don't know if anyone who's, in earshot of my voice, can write a check to get billboards, against anti-Semitism billboards, on major intersections in major cities. But I guess sort of the question is, assuming that you're not in that position, assuming that you can't go ahead and take out billboards or donate $25 million to directly influence political campaigns, I guess the question is, so what can we do aside from coming together and talking about it? Are there other things that we can do to stand up against anti-Semitism?
That's a great question, Meth, and I'm glad you asked. So I think that there's a few different things that we can look at. One thing we can look at is, it's interesting that the very idea that the Ron that we started with talks about is the fact that we are different. That places us under scrutiny. You mentioned also, your friend had highlighted that now that these New York Times stories are out, realize that the world is watching now more carefully than they would otherwise, because they want to know, is it true?
Right.
And they want to know, hey, there's another paper somewhere's looking for another scoop because New York Times did it. No, maybe I'll give it a shot too. So it really is incumbent on us to make sure that we're behaving and we're really acting in a way that's beyond question in everything that we do. And the truth of the matter is, there's a much deeper reason why we should be doing that. There's one idea that, well, you want to say something?
Well, just to, you mentioned that friend, I mentioned earlier, we were having that conversation, and she really wrote back, and I thought it was very, very smart. She said, like, look, yes, the fact that the New York Times specifically, and they're highlighting all these flaws and warts within the Jewish community. And again, she argued many of them are true. And I said back, yeah, but why is the New York Times focusing on our group as opposed to all the other groups? And she said, it's a good point. It does really show that they are, the anti-Semitism. But she wrote back, but the reality is that we are under the microscope. People are looking at the Jewish community, and therefore it's incumbent on us to recognize we are under scrutiny. So it behooves us, let's not give anti-Semites room to say, aha, look, you see all those Jews, they are liars and thieves and they're dishonest. If we carry ourselves with integrity, if we carry ourselves and interact with others with this, such a good Yiddish word, ehrlichkeit, which I don't know, I guess means integrity, honesty, and people see, that Jewish people are nice people, Jewish people are good model citizens, and it takes out the ability for the New York Times to post those, those kinds of articles.
Yeah, and I want to just kind of make that, just drill down a little bit on that in a more just super practical way. So I was driving it was in upstate New York. This goes about 25 years ago. It's late at night. It's just me and my brother in the car, and we pull over on the side of the highway to go to a gas station to fill up. In the middle of the night, freezing cold, no one's around, and in walks right behind me into this little service station in the Catskill Mountains in the middle of the winter, a skinhead. Legit skinhead, with the fatigues, everything. He was like the real deal. And I look at this guy, he looks at me, and we just stand there looking at each other for a second. And then I just sometimes, you say something before you even know what you're saying. And I said, Billy. And he's like, Eli, how you doing? So I knew Billy. I never knew he was a skinhead, but we worked together in the summer.
Wow.
He was the caretaker in camp. And Billy, for the summer job, which was in a religious camp, he would always grow some hair. I found that out afterwards because he looked much less scary, when he had hair. It was probably covering whatever tattoo was in the back of his head. And we started talking. Now, Billy was literally best friends. He was probably 23, 24 years old, best friends with the main rabbi in camp, Rabbi Bluth.
No way.
And it was I guarantee you, for the rest of Billy's life, as much as he's a skinhead, he didn't have a Nazi thing on the back, whatever was tattooed on the back of his head, it was just one of those things that looked scary, like a skull or something like that. He was a tough guy, but I guarantee you, Billy is never, ever going to beat up a Jew. Because he knew a bunch of Jews, and he knew they were good people. And that's something that we really all can do in a micro way. All of us really have, and I want to tell one more story quickly because I want to show off. Story goes like this. The other night I'm in Smith's. All my good stories happen in grocery stores. I spent too much time in grocery stores. So I'm in Smith's and I'm at the cashier, and the cashier says to me, she says, I would compliment your tie, but I know that your brother picked it out for you, so you're not going to accept the compliments. I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's impressive. How does she know that? Because you know why? A few nights ago, I was in Smith's, and she complimented my tie. It was a nice tie, even nicer than this one. My brother got me this one too, if you like it. And she said, well, this is a nice tie. And I said, oh, don't compliment me. My brother doesn't trust my taste in clothing, so he picks out all my ties for me. He orders them. I just send them a Zelle payment for whatever they come out to be. And I'm realizing to myself that I can have that level of rapport with someone that I might never, ever see her again. But if you're kind and nice and communicate nicely with people around you, the chances she knows I'm Jewish. She has this feeling that I'm Jewish, right? the chances of her think that all Jews are jerks it's much lower if she knows that the couple of Jews she meets at 11 o'clock at night in Smith's are actually nice guys.
I've shared in the past, it's an amazing story. I've shared in the past really a remarkable story, which the details of the story are really, worthy of like a whole class in its own right. It's an absolutely astonishing story, and it really answers a real question that during World War II, if you study your history, many Jews, unfortunately not nearly many as should have been, but many Jews were saved through Japan. They got visas and they were able, of all places, they went through Japan, famously the Mir Yeshiva, with, and many other yeshivas who were attached to the Mir Yeshiva. I think it was a group of almost 2,500 people. It was 500, but I think the whole group was almost in over 2,000, were saved because of the kindness that Japan, in the early months and early years of the war, they provided visas and transit visas, and the entire Mir Yeshiva was able to escape to Kobe, Japan, and then from there they were able to make their way to China, where they were able to ride out the war. And always the question, is why was Japan willing and okay, harboring and saving, rescuing Jews? If you recall World War II history, Japan was on the wrong team. Japan was allied with the Nazis. Why was Japan in the business of saving and rescuing Jews? And one of the theories, it's a pretty well-accepted theory. One of the well-accepted theories was that in the early 1900s, during the Japanese-Russian War, the Japanese were woefully underfinanced, and they were extended loans, and they worked very closely with a very wealthy Jew from the United States, Jacob Schiff, and they loved him and they deeply appreciated how Jacob Schiff would help finance Japan and their military, and did acts of kindness for the Japanese. And the Japanese, the emperor himself, had a deep bond with the Jewish people because of that interaction. Fast forward, 40 years later, when the Jews are in peril, because they had that positive interaction, they were willing to rescue Jews.
That's a super important idea. And again, that's a little bit more on the macro, but on the micro, all of us can be that on some level. I think that the hour is late, and I want to get in one of our favorite rabbis here, of Hirsch. And I think that might be the climax, and we'll wish you all a good evening. Rabbi, take it away.
Rabbi Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, writing in the mid-1800s, he talks about anti-Semitism, and he was talking about the Hanukkah story, but he was also talking about anti-Semitism in Germany. Now, he's writing before the Holocaust. He's writing, a good, 60, 80 years before Nazism. And just his words are so powerful. He writes, "It is only natural. Respect yourself, respect your past, respect your own sanctuary, and you will see that whatever opinion is held of you, whether you are regarded with favor or with disfavor, respect will not be denied you. But if you do not respect yourself, if you look contemptuously on the tombs of your ancestors, if you no longer consider your sanctuary worthy of respect, even of recognition, how could you demand that a stranger shall respect you or respect your fathers? You may find many things in the world, but for respect, you will beg in vain." Rabbi Hirsch is really, I believe, he's highlighting such an important idea, and that is so many Jews in his time, the 1860s, and 1870s, fast forward to our day, so many Jews are so marginally Jewish and so not self-respecting of their own Judaism. So many Jews, tragically, sadly, I don't even mean self-hating Jews, but Jews who are just really ambivalent about their Judaism, about their engagement with the Torah, about their connection with their Judaism. If we don't respect ourselves and our lineage and our rich ancestry and what Judaism has to offer, well, if we kind of look at Judaism askance, if we look at Jews and we look at them and say, what they don't know what they're doing, they're backwards, or it doesn't resonate with me. So of course non-Jews aren't going to respect Judaism. If we don't respect ourselves, Rabbi Hirsch is arguing, we can't expect other people to respect us as well. And I think it's really a call to action. What can we do to solve anti-Semitism? So again, as Rabbi Davidowitz pointed out, like, I'm not in a position, not yet, to take out billboards, and throw around that kind of money to make that kind of impact. But what I can do, and what each and every one of us can do, is embrace our own Judaism. Be proud of our Judaism, not be ashamed of our Judaism. If not that, even take a step forward, do even more in terms of our Jewish practice, our Jewish identity. If we take pride in our Judaism, if we go ahead and really embrace with both of our arms and give our Judaism a big hug, then, we have a shot of having other people respect our, Judaism as well.
Just to put a cap on that, the Ran is teaching us that there's nothing that we can really do to completely get rid of anti-Semitism, because it's within the nature of the world. There is, we call it the in-group, out-group bias. Yeah. But that's not the end of the story. What we can do is on a personal level, and all of us as people, watching now and go tell your friends, is we can live lives that debunk every single anti-Semitic theory.
Right.
We can be, generous and not greedy, and you name whatever. We can tip well at restaurants, but in all seriousness, is we really can debunk those. So that's something that's within, and that's really on the deepest level. I want to end with one thought, and then we'll call it a night. But it's a fascinating Gemara that Rabbi Meth and Rabbi Goldman actually told us about this morning. We were discussing this upcoming webinar. There's a Gemara that the Talmud asks a question in Tractate Pesachim, is why is it that God has spread us out through all the world? What are we doing in Vegas? What are we doing in America? What are we doing? All Jews are all over the world. What are we doing here? And to translate the Gemara loosely, and just to get to really the point, the way that the primary commentaries understand the Gemara, the answer is so that we can show the world what it means to be a good person, what it means to believe in Hashem, to follow His Torah, to be upstanding, to have morals, to have ethics, all those things. If we are doing what we're supposed to be doing, we are going to debunk anti-Semitism. We're going to prove Kanye and all of his buddies wrong. And that's something that if each of us on a grassroots effort really worked on, we can have an absolute amazing impact. Friends, thank you so much for joining us on this.
This conversation is certainly not exhausted. There's so much more to talk about. The hour is late. And I want to thank you all for participating. And as always, we're always here if anyone has any thoughts, questions. We're always a phone call, email, or text message away. And I want to thank you all for participating and wish everyone